Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 51st episode of the Superhero Ethics Podcast. I'm Matthew Westfox, one of your hosts.
I'm Jacob Milicic. I am the other one of your regular hosts.
And today we've got a really exciting idea. Many of you may also be fans of a podcast that I'm a great fan of and that really helped to inspire this podcast, the MCU podcast, where Matt and Jeff look at a lot of MCU properties and discuss them in great detail. I and they have had some back and forth, and on a recent episode they were doing about things they wanted to see of two characters like facing off. They got into a discussion about one particular face-off, which was the Punisher and Daredevil. And at one point they said, hey, superhero ethics, what do you guys think? What makes Punisher and Daredevil different? And I thought, you know what, that sounds like a fun challenge. That's one I want to take up, and seems like a fun idea to base a podcast off of, at least a mini one. And then as Jacob and I were discussing it and kicking the idea around, we realized, we've gotten a lot of great feedback from other listeners and fans that we haven't had a chance to respond to. So we're going to take this episode to start with that question and kind of do a feedback response to Matt and Jeff, and then to jump into some of our other listeners and hear from some of their questions and thoughts to earlier podcasts and ideas and go into their comments and questions. So, Jacob, let me just start with the basis of that question. On the MCUCast, they were wrestling with this idea of what is the difference between Kingpin and Punisher? Or is there one? Are they actually, from a moral, ethical perspective, fairly similar?
So, it's a very difficult question, and one I'm really excited to dive into, because it's one of the reasons it's so challenging is because you wouldn't even try to make the comparison were there not some similarities, were there not some parallels you could draw. The big thing, I think, comes down to, at least in the media that we see in the Netflix Marvel series, it actually has a lot to do with perspective. It also has a little bit to do with their goals. What I mean by perspective is when we're presented the character of Punisher, we are presented as the Punisher as somebody whose mission at its core is centered in some kind of system of morality, right? Where what Punisher is trying to accomplish is some kind of greater good. And we are still presented it like when Punisher and Daredevil are having their argument, they're not arguing about whether it's right to fight crime people, right? They're arguing about whether it's right to use lethal force, right? Whereas if Punisher and Kingpin were having an argument, the argument wouldn't, the use of lethal force, whether or not it's warranted, wouldn't enter into the conversation. I think they would both agree that no, like you reach a point, it is more efficient and more effective to just eliminate a threat rather than trying to rehabilitate them. But when we're presented the Punisher, it's still this case of, something bad happened to him, and now he's on this mission to correct a major wrong within our government, within a particular organization. Whereas Kingpin's principal motivation when he started out was based on his tragedy, his trauma, informing his actions to say, okay, I need to fundamentally change the environment that I'm in to be more like I think it should be. Yeah. And it's not quite megalomania, but it's that kind of idea where rather than fighting the bad things that they happen and fighting the bad people who do the bad things, I want to change the world so that things that I consider bad don't happen as frequently.
And it's funny from the way you say that, because I think one of the issues we're definitely going to get into at some point in this discussion is the fact that Punisher is presented to us eventually as a antagonist. As a protagonist. Whereas he is at first presented, and Kingpin is always presented as an antagonist. And I do think that that's, in some ways, I feel like you could, in the same way that like the Punisher starts out as Daredevil's antagonist, but then gets his own story, and thus almost by definition becomes a little more sympathetic. I do feel like you could now have a Kingpin series in which he appeared much more sympathetic and much more. So I think that part of the perspective matters. But what I think is interesting, it's the way you described it. What I'm kind of hearing is, and maybe you're not quite meaning this, but the way I take it is, Punisher something bad happened to the Punisher, and I mean, by his name, he now wants to punish the people who did the bad thing. Kingpin had terrible things happen to him and saw terrible things happening to his mother and to his neighborhood, and now wants to prevent those things happening to others. By that definition, Kingpin's more of a hero than Punisher.
That sounds very heroic, right? So again, it's all a matter of perspective. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say I think Kingpin is actually a hero. I also don't think, and we've gone on record saying this, I don't think Punisher is a hero either. I think that Punisher advances some goals and some agendas that we would consider heroic or good, but for me, I feel that means matter.
Yeah.
And so to a certain point, your means no longer justify the end, or whatever. The other way around, right? The end does not always justify the means. And I think both Punisher and Kingpin would, if they sat down and had a conversation, would agree on the idea that the ends justify the means. That if it is in service of a goal that is noble and just, or by their definition is correct, right? Because I don't think Kingpin is super concerned with nobility, but or with justice. Although, again, when we're looking at things from his perspective, he does seem to have his own kind of brand of justice, his own kind of idea about what is correct and what is right for the world. But whatever gets them to that end goal, that's what they're going to do.
I do think that on some level, Punisher is more honest with himself about his motivations, because I think if you listen to what each one of them is saying their motivations are, I think Kingpin comes across as much more heroic, much more sympathetic. And like, on that level, I would say I agree with Kingpin's ends. I don't agree with the means he uses. I don't agree with Punisher's ends, because Punisher, I think, from the beginning is just saying, I am out for revenge on the people who hurt me. A side goal of that may be that these people don't get to hurt other people.
Right.
But at the end of the day, that's not what Frank Castle cares about. He is out for personal revenge. I think Kingpin tells himself and tells others that his goal is to make sure that the bad people who hurt others, who hurt him, don't hurt others the way they hurt him. But on some level, and I that show is so psychologically complex that I'm fairly certain the writers intended this, but certainly what comes across is that on some level, the part of why Kingpin has so much rage, part of why he has so much, he loses control, he decapitates people with a car door, this kind of thing, is because what he is telling himself is a quest for justice, is on some level him doing the same thing that Frank Castle is doing, which is processing his feelings of rage and grief and sorrow by doing terrible things to the people who hurt him, or in his case, people like the people who hurt him.
Right, or people that in some moments upset him. So Kingpin, and this is one of the reasons why Kingpin is such a compelling villain, right, is that he is very much the hero of his own story. And you hear this, this is a very common trope or not trope, but a coaching tool for actors. When they're having a problem feeling a character, is to always remember that from that character's perspective, most of the time, unless that character is the Joker in certain instances, what that character is convinced what they're doing is right, and they've got a narrative that has led them to this point.
Right.
So getting back to the question of, where does the line, where do you draw the line that makes Punisher a hero and Kingpin a villain? If we're accepting that argument, which I don't necessarily accept, we would have to analyze their means. We've both agreed that their means in each case are reasonably deplorable. Right? Just because Castle is scraping a bad person's face across glass doesn't make that act any better than Kingpin decapitating someone with a car door. Right? Like, that doesn't enter into it. So we have to fire means, we just have to look at their goals. And here again, and I think you raised a very excellent point, Castle's principal goal actually puts him more on the villain side of the spectrum than Kingpin's principal goal. And I don't think Kingpin's actually achieving what he wants to achieve, but that doesn't mean that the idea, the gentrification side of Kingpin's goal is garbage. Fire that into the sun, right? But the general principle, it's the same thing Batman wants, right? He wants order. right? And we celebrate Batman as a hero most of the time.
Well, there's two things I would say. One is that I think even the gentrification point, I think you and I have a lot of political objections to the way gentrification happens. But I think it's important to remember that, like, for Kingpin, gentrification is a means to an end. And it is, so I think that it is in his mind, it is the way of cleaning up a neighborhood, of making it safer, which unfortunately also means whiter and those kind of things. But that aside, but I also think what's really important here is that for Wilson Fisk, what he is seeing in terms of the problems of the neighborhood, in a lot of ways, he and Daredevil have the exact same goal. They want Hell's Kitchen to be better. I think if Daredevil knew about what happened to 8-year-old Wilson Fisk, Daredevil would say, absolutely, I don't want that to happen to any child, any mother in my neighborhood. And I'm really glad you brought up Batman, because we have talked about how Batman is heroic, but Batman can become really problematic. And in a lot of ways, I think Daredevil and Wilson Fisk are good Batman and bad Batman. You know, it is the sort of the line there, the when he starts to slip into them, because I think an essential part, what Daredevil wants, it seems, is to give people the chance to make the neighborhood the best they can for themselves. Fisk wants for him to tell everyone else how the other neighborhood is better. But bring it back to him and Punisher, I mostly agree with you, and I do think on that level, Punisher's ends to me are not quite, I think Punisher's ends to me are not quite as noble as Fisk's. But I do think there are some differences in their means. And I know Paul has some thoughts on this too that we'll weigh into in a few minutes, but first I just want you and I to go back and forth a little more. Because there's two things I think in the difference between Punisher and Fisk. One I think is legitimate, one I don't. First, the way they're presented to us in the show, Punisher seems to care a lot more about avoiding collateral damage than Wilson Fisk does. To some extent, this feels like bad writing, because Punisher goes into hospitals blasting shotguns while nurses and doctors are running around, but just miraculously doesn't hit them. So on some level, I feel like the writers do a bad, in that same kind of like...
You don't understand, Matthew. He's just such a good shot that
Right.
He can take a scatter shot weapon and only hit bad guys with it. He's got spell sculpting for his shotgun.
Exactly. And this is the same issue with, like, Daredevil not wanting to kill people but hitting them in the head with an iron. There are times when our characters do things that shouldn't live up to their moral values. But even putting that aside, I think the other big difference is the way they treat the people who are, at least in theory, on their side. Punisher obviously gets deeply frustrated with the people who are trying to stop him for good reasons. The other cops. What's the computer geek's name who he works a lot with?
Not Deep Thought. Deep Thought is the thing from
Gizmo?
Hitchhiker's Guide.
No, Gizmo's the gremlin.
It has now been too long. I don't remember the character's name, the character's code name.
Okay, but you know who I mean.
Yeah. The guy who was the spook.
When people like that screw up, Punisher gets mad at them. Punisher flirts with his wife a little bit to get back at him. Like, Punisher fucks with him a little bit. When people who are trying to do the thing that Wilson Fisk wants them to do screw up, Wilson Fisk kills them. And I do think that is one specific difference in means between the two of them, of as much as Punisher thinks that that if you have crossed a moral line, anything can be done to you because you are now a bad guy. But if you're a good guy, that can't be done to you. Wilson Fisk, it seems, believes terrible things can be done to good guys if it's in service to the larger goal. And I do think that's one major difference between the two of them.
Right. No, and I agree with that. That's a really good point. It's also, to draw another parallel, to draw another similarity between the two of them, they both have terrible anger management.
Yes.
And this is something that when it happens with the Punisher, it's scary to us because he's being presented as somebody who's on the right side of things most of the time. When Kingpin is having his anger management problems and is throwing a tantrum and killing people or whatever, or bludgeoning somebody with his fists, it's it's expected almost, right?
Yeah.
It's all like, oh, this is why this is a bad guy. But really, it's the same issue. And it's the same, like, root cause of their problem. Um, of what makes their means so troubling
Right.
to me, so upsetting to me, that they're both principally motivated a lot of the time in the moment by their anger, by this very negative emotion.
hmm I definitely think, there's one other question I want to ask, and then we should go to some of the other comments. First of all, I think the priest from Daredevil, who at one point says to Matt, like, are you trying to do good things because you want the universe to be better, or are you like the priest asks Matt the same thing that I'm saying that Kingpin and Punisher haven't dealt with, which is, are you enjoying doing bad things to people who you think deserve it? And I think that priest would see Frank Castle and Wilson Fisk very much in the same light. The other point, though, that I think has to be made, and this is more of a meta commentary about any ethical analysis we do, is that the Punisher and Wilson Fisk are presented to us in fundamentally different ways. Wilson Fisk is very specifically the big bad of the season in which he appears. And he's also always been, in the comics, the bad guy. Often to Spider-Man, even more so than Daredevil. Punisher is presented as, if not heroic, an anti-hero, and a protagonist, not an antagonist. And I think we're diving into some of how that plays out, but I do think it's important to remember that those things influence the way we see these two characters. And I think if we had an entire season of Daredevil with Punisher as the antagonist, or if, like I said, we had a season of Kingpin, that would also change our moral calculus on these two, because it's impossible to, we don't have an objective 360-degree view of these two characters. We have the view that Netflix Marvel is giving us, which is as antagonist or protagonist.
Right, right. That was exactly what I was trying to get to when I talked about perspective earlier.
Yeah.
It's that idea that when we are presented these stories, we get we always get a lens, right? There's never a third person omniscient thing happening where we know everything that's going on with everybody. There's always a framework associated with it. Sometimes a literal framework where we're dealing with artificial intelligences, and sometimes a more
It turns out,
framework.
folks, that attacking Zack Snyder has been replaced by attacking the treatment of Ada in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Go on. So check off that bingo note.
Ada and all artificial life, honestly, in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Like, seriously, writers on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., I know you've been renewed for at least another half season, and please, like, you know what you did. Fix it.
I would agree with that.
Microchip, David Lieberman.
Microchip.
By the way, Microchip. It was driving me nuts. I had to look it up.
Awesome.
David Lieberman and Microchip was his like code name.
Awesome.
Yep.
So let me ask, before we get into some comments, where do you think is the similarity? I mean, we've sort of mentioned it in passing with the other things, but let's specifically dive into how are Kingpin and Punisher similar?
So, very obviously, their principal means of conflict resolution is violence. And they don't really have another avenue that they pursue. Kingpin does actually, there's a slight difference here where Kingpin actually does pursue other avenues because he's managed to accumulate some wealth and some power and has the ability to do other things. But when you get right down to it, if there's something they dislike, their first instinct, their first primary modus operandi, there we go, is to punch it, right? Punch it, shoot it, kill it dead. Another way in which they're similar, as we talked about before, is their anger. One of their principal emotions. They're both examples of toxic masculinity. Yes, I would say,
very
right?
Much so.
In very many ways. In fact, what I find interesting about each character is the only times we see them being gentle are when they're interacting with women. And it's that to me, like, so with Punisher, it's with Karen Page, and with Lieberman's wife starts with oh goodness, it's been too long. Sarah? Was her name Sarah? Yeah. And with Kingpin,
and even there, Punisher with the dog, he's somewhat gentle with the son, but much more so with Sarah, with David's daughter.
Yes, right, exactly. Yeah, with his daughter. And with Kingpin, with his love interest, again, now it's been way too long, and I definitely cannot remember that character's name. Which is she's from the comics. It's a like
Mm-hmm.
we know this person goes on to marry Wilson Fisk. And when she showed up, I was like, this character's great. It's going to add a whole new dynamic to the show, and I'm really excited about it. It's going to drive me nuts because my brain is not working well for names. But Fisk's interactions with her are so gentle, so earnest. Vanessa, yes, Vanessa, that's the one. Um, so it's a case where all of their other interactions are these, like, again, very very toxic masculine uh, behaviors. And that is centered in that idea of anger being the only emotion that's acceptable to express and all of that. And if people want to learn more about academically what toxic masculinity is, there's a wealth of information out there that is far more educated on the topic than I. So I'm not going to sit here and try to pretend to be an expert. Um, what do you think? Kicking it back to you, a couple of other similarities you could come up with between the two characters.
So I think that's definitely true. I agree with a lot of what you said. I think, and very much tied into that is that both of them, I think, have a great sense of their own personal power. I do think here's an important to note a distinction. Frank Castles is primarily physical. He's never rich. He doesn't have power, but he feels like he has a physical power over his world. Wilson Fisk, I think you're right. He does resort to violence, but most of his early attempts to deal with things are much more like the chessboard. I mean, he's much more thinking strategically, whereas Frank Castle is thinking tactically. But I think even so, Wilson Fisk does have a degree of physical power to himself, but he also has a degree of that he can move the pieces, he can move the financial pieces, the social pieces. But in both cases, I think they both have a sense of when their power feels taken away, when they feel like they are not able to protect the things they love, they're going to lash out in violence, which I think you're right, is a very toxic male thing to do. I also think that they both have a sense of, and you were talking about it, but I think it's really important to re-underline that the means justify the ends. That the means justify the ends, but also that
The ends justify the
the
means.
ends justify
Flip
the
the
means.
script.
Sorry, yeah,
Yep.
we both messed that up. The ends justify the means, but also that there's distinctly different classes of people: the good who deserve moral treatment, unless you screw up in Wilson Fisk's world, and the bad. And that for both of them, there is no sense of the enemy has to be treated well. I think that both of them have a real sense of brutality and sort of the opposite of any kind of chivalry, which seems a sort of outdated concept, but I think Captain America especially would be just horrified by both of these people because he's so dedicated to the idea of like a fair fight, doing things the right and good way.
Right, and somebody who clearly believes in rehabilitation, I feel, unless you're like a literal Nazi,
right.
but like, and even in those cases, I think he, like, if it's somebody who he knew, like, if Captain America right now, saw General Talbot, at the end of Agents of Shield, he would be 100% sitting there trying to help rehabilitate him.
Yes.
As it turns out, Captain America was occupied during those events, so that didn't happen.
Exactly.
Uh,
No, I think it's true. I think, and it's there's a lot of ways in which I am sad about the lack of crossover between the Marvel movies and the Marvel TV shows. But Kingpin and Punisher, actually, one of the ways in which I most feel that is in regard to the character of Spider-Man.
mm-hmm.
Because I feel like Spider-Man, even more than Daredevil, makes such a good moral foil to both Kingpin and, like, in some ways, the best way to understand how similar Kingpin and Punisher both are is imagine both of them in a conversation with Spider-Man.
Right.
Just because his sort of like boyish innocence and his sort of desire to still shake hands after a good fair fight with the people he fights with is just so different from anything Punisher or Kingpin would believe.
Plus, we get that delightful mocking of all of the skulls that Punisher puts on all of his things.
Yes, also very true.
The best Spider-Man is the snarky, witty Spider-Man.
Very true. Yeah. So let's That's kind of the first bit of feedback, but especially on this question. Paul, I know, would have wanted to be part of this. He couldn't be for time reasons, but he actually sent in some thoughts that I want to read and get our thoughts on. So he wrote, I think this is Paul, our other often co-host, I think the two characters are super different. A lot has to do with perspective, no doubt, but also, one, Castle mostly focuses on kill bad guys and tries to avoid collateral damage. Kingpin doesn't seem to care at all about collateral damage. He'll kill anyone in his way.
Point that you made earlier, right? And it's like 100% agree that is a major difference between the two characters. Even though, as you said, sometimes the writers don't do the best job of showing us Castle caring about collateral damage.
But yeah, exactly. But I believe that that's what they're telling us he's supposed to believe in. The second thing he says is that Castle doesn't benefit in a material fashion from his efforts, except stealing lots of guns. Fisk's manipulations have led him to fantastic wealth and power. So it's easier to see his motivation as justification for his actions rather than the root reason. Of course, Mabel Castle just likes killing people.
I think, yeah, that's an interesting one. I think there's some truth to both of those. It is very easy for us to see, oh, well, Fisk has a bunch of money, has a bunch of wealth and power, so he must be evil. It's very easy for many of us, especially in our generation, to demonize or to automatically assume the worst of people who have accumulated massive amounts of wealth. And again, we're never given anything counter to that lens. We're being presented Kingpin as a villain, and I think Castle to some extent does like killing people.
Yeah, I mean, I as I was reading this comment from Paul, I think I half agree and half disagree. I do think that it's true that it's hard to believe. Like, Castle never claims to be altruistic. Fisk claims to be altruistic, and I do think that the amount of personal benefits Fisk has gotten belies his claim of altruism to some extent. So I think Paul's right there. But I also think that last point he throws in as kind of an aside is actually a very important one, that maybe Castle does benefit because he likes killing people. And I think it's really relevant that in that season of Punisher, one of the points that gets made many, many times is we see soldiers who are really having trouble coming back to civilian life. And Castle is presented in sort of opposition to the soldiers who can't let go, that soldier who digs himself a foxhole that he can sleep in and things like that. Whereas Castle is presented, that those people are not integrating well because they haven't been able to let go of the war.
Right.
And Castle is presented as someone who has, and yet he has now come back and found another war to fight. And granted, it's a very legitimate war to fight, but I do think that there is something there of Castle is benefiting from this in a way, and that Castle is being able to not have to deal with integrating himself into civilian life because he has found a war. It's that old adage of, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Mm-hmm.
In season 1 of Punisher, yes, this is a pretty clear nail for his hammer. But it does make you sort of wonder if by season 3, season 4, if this happened, I kind of hope they don't, but if they did, would the level of like finding a nail get thinner and thinner, and it be really just Castle trying to find a way to not have to stop fighting?
Right. No, I think that's a great point that you bring up, that like we're being presented him as a means of contrasting people who haven't gotten over the war, who haven't gotten over their experience. But in a lot of ways, he's John Rambo. He's John Rambo from First Blood, where it's the same problem, where it's like, no, you didn't come back from the war and shrug it off and start going on with your life. You found another fight.
Right.
And that's actually worse in a lot of ways. So I'm really glad you brought that point up. It's something that I hadn't really thought about before, but I think it's symptomatic if symptomatic's the wrong word. It illustrates why he is such a violence-focused character, I think. Because for him, his enemy shifted, but he has an enemy. And it's never a time when he doesn't have any, so he gets that. There's never a time he doesn't have an enemy, so he never gets that lapse in clarity. We get some flashback scenes that are supposed to be showing us him having problems after coming back from the war, right?
Right.
Having some problems recovering, having like nightmares and whatnot. But as soon as he finds another enemy, he's fine. But that doesn't mean we get to actually contrast him with the people who are still struggling, because all he did was shift his focus and go back into the soldier mentality.
And I think that the way you put it is really good, because one of the things I think the show does a great job of is pointing out that one of the dangers with our military, and with most militaries, but especially the way it's done now, is we teach people to be killing machines. And we teach them to not worry about who to kill and who not to kill, because someone else will tell you.
Mm-hmm.
And so that gives you a very black and white idea of these people you kill, these people you don't. And what you're just saying there about how like Captain America or Spider-Man or some of these characters, they often, not always, but they often want to sort of find the humanity in the person, and say, is this a person who needs to be killed, or can they be sort of reconciled in some way? I think this is the last thing I would say is a really big similarity is that for both Wilson Fisk and for Punisher, if you're the bad guy, there's no way to reconcile that. And even where, like, to me, one of the biggest ways in which I see this with Kingpin is the way he views Daredevil. Because to most people in Kingpin's position would see what Daredevil is doing is 90% of what I want to do. He is absolutely helping my end goal. But because Daredevil is interfering with Kingpin's specific means of getting to that goal,
Mm-hmm.
Kingpin sees him as just as bad as one of the criminals.
Right.
And I think that's really relevant.
Well, I mean, he is technically a criminal.
Yeah.
Daredevil is not operating inside of the legal system in any way.
Yeah. No, it's very true.
These are not sanctioned actions.
And it's funny because Wilson Fisk is just as much of a criminal.
Yep.
But he's a much more respectable one.
Right.
It's sort of the difference. He's the white collar criminal.
Yeah.
So the third thing Paul pointed out was, as part of why he sees them as different, is, and quote, Castle frequently puts himself in physical jeopardy to help people. I think seeing him get beat up and fight for the underdog is a big part of his relatability. What's your take on that?
I mean, that's fair. I like capacity for self-sacrifice is something we like throwing into our heroes to make them more compelling. It's also something that okay, cynical hat on. I'm real tired of it. Like, not like seriously, we don't need more martyrs. We don't need more people trying to sacrifice themselves or throw themselves in front of whatever. We need heroes that actually act responsibly and help avoid those types of situations. And yes, sometimes like jumping in front of a bullet, but like, yeah, he puts himself in harm's way constantly to advance his goals. And that is that is something we've traditionally characterized as heroic. I would say that if that's the only thing that separates Frank Castle from Wilson Fisk, that's not nearly good enough. And these other points that Paul has brought up, I think are good. And I like they do show some distinction. What they don't do for me, and this one again, I don't think it does enough, is say Castle's a hero, Punisher's a hero, Kingpin's a villain, Fisk is a villain.
Yeah. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, more than anything, what they show me is that the line between relatable villain and anti-hero is an incredibly gray one. And I think we have pointed out some differences between Frank and Fisk, and that, to me, there isn't a bright line, there's a continuum. And I do think Castle is more along the heroic line than Fisk is in many ways. As I said, not in terms of their goals. I think Fisk's goals are actually more heroic. But I think more than anything, it really points out that just how gray an area that is, and that I think almost on any day of the week, you might, if you just looked at their actions on one day, you might say, oh, actually, Kingpin is really the hero, because so much of it is contextual. And again, it also really comes down to how these two people's stories are being told. And that I think from the stories we have been given, I think, though they are very similar in many ways, there are these distinct ways we've mentioned that makes Castle a little bit more heroic or a little more at least an anti-hero. But that I think you could tell another, like, if we did what Matt and Jeff were suggesting of having a season that was Kingpin and Punisher, like, I think that would be fantastic television and really good. But frankly, depending on how you wrote it, I think you could write it as either one of them being the protagonist, and either one coming out somewhat heroic and being fairly true to the character of each. Like, I think, especially because where they are right now, either one of them could go in such a different way,
I feel like if I were to write that show or have anything to do with it, I would actually make it so that each time you are seeing things from that character's perspective, they're clearly in the right.
Yeah.
And have them at odds with each other, right? But have it be a story of two people who are both trying to do something good, and each of them not necessarily using the best means to get there, and working at cross purposes, because I think that would be the most interesting and fascinating story, and a really good exercise for what makes us decide
Yeah.
when someone's a hero and when someone isn't.
So in some weird ways, I actually think that this story could maybe even be better told as a book. And I don't mean a comic book. I specifically mean an actual narrative book. And the reason I'm saying that is because of Song of Ice and Fire at Game of Thrones. Because I like the TV show of those books, but what I think made the book specifically so good is that there is no global narrator. Every chapter is told very distinctly from one character's point of view, and obviously that character is always the hero in their point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And you often have situations where you have a conversation between two characters as told by one character, and then the next time those two characters interact, their interactions are told to you by the other character, and it really makes you question, like, wait a minute, which one of these perspectives is right? Are either right? I think what I would love is a kind of Game of Thrones style book told from maybe 5 characters' perspectives, but primarily Wilson Fisk and Frank Castle, where you get to see how each one of them really is convinced that they are the hero of their own story. Because I think that would just be such an interesting way of exploring how these two characters are similar, how these two characters are different, and how easy it is, depending on who's telling the story, for us to side with one or the other.
So for Matt and Jeff, the answer is I don't think there is a clear line. There are definitely ethical considerations in each moment, and we can analyze different actions of each of these characters as either, no, this is more villainous, this is more heroic, or this is amoral, this is more moral, this is just, this is unjust, right? Yeah. But I don't think I can sit here and tell you, well, this is the dividing line that makes Punisher fall on one side and Kingpin fall on another, because I don't think it exists.
Yeah.
And that may sound like a cop-out, but it has been about a 40-minute cop-out, so I think that we've done a reasonable job of
it's about time to move on.
Pontificating.
But yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And first of all, just thank you guys, to Matt and Jeff, for suggesting this topic. I think there's so much here to discuss. And I think I come down where you do, Jacob, that at the end of the day, and I think Matt and Jeff were alluding to this, the reason why a season of those two characters together would be so interesting is because although there are differences, they are very hard to sketch out. And I think in some ways, like, to me, part of why I loved Marvel's Civil War so much, and that's actually what we're going to get into some feedback next about, is that it is entirely possible to walk out of Marvel Civil War thinking that Tony was the hero or thinking that Cap was the hero. Mm-hmm. And I think the filmmakers did an amazing job with that because the line between those two characters is so gray. And I think in many ways Punisher and Daredevil, Punisher and Kingpin would be very, very similar. So on that note, thank you guys. Let's now turn to some of the other listener feedback we've gotten. People who've either sent us in Facebook quotes or Twitter things. And let's keep on going with that topic of Civil War. Because actually, as we were getting ready for Infinity War, I posted something as Superhero Ethics and asked people sort of, what is your sort of end-all thoughts on Civil War in terms of how you're getting ready for Infinity War? And we got some great comments. One is from Andy Peterson, who's someone who we know through the Magic Judge program. Great guy, and glad to have him listening. And he wrote, I feel based on his experiences in Avengers and Winter Soldier, Cap had every reason to not trust the Accords because it puts a group in charge that can manipulate how they respond. He wants to be part of the discussion on what they do so they can act when needed and not wait to respond. He wants to be better for prevention and protection, which a bureaucracy is bad at based on their separate political goals. And there's a second half to what he wrote, but just based on that, that sentiment really hit me because I had often been saying, Tony is reacting to the events of Ultron and how scared he is of trusting himself. I hadn't really given enough credit until Andy pointed it out that Cap has been just as burned from the exact opposite direction. Tony is saying, don't trust me, trust a bureaucracy. Cap has just seen the bureaucracy to which he has dedicated his life, be utterly taken over by Hydra, and now he doesn't want to trust them.
Yeah, and this was a great point, Andy. Thank you so much for bringing this up, because he's right. From Captain America's perspective, there's no such creature. Like, he thought there was an incontrovertible, immutable, moral institution in S.H.I.E.L.D., and that turned out to not be true. Hydra got its tentacles in there, and now Hydra is like completely turned that thing on its ear. And so Cap is very much responding to his own each character, and the reason why this conflict comes to a head is each character is responding to their own personal trauma at being betrayed. Tony betrayed himself, and Cap got betrayed by the institutions he held dear.
Yeah.
And these were things that, like, if there's one person that Tony, up until that point in his life, had really trusted, had really felt was like, had his back, it was Tony Stark,
Yeah.
right? And I'm not saying that because he's a raving egomaniac, although he is. But I'm saying that because he's been the principal force in his life, driving his life forward, right? So he's been the person that he can rely on, and he's clearly built his framework around that, which is why he has difficulty making personal connections with people, because at the end of the day, the person he cares most about is himself. Cap got into the damn military because he was going to be any good at all at fighting. In fact, he struggled during training, but he really wanted to help represent his nation. He wanted to help with the fight. I know you and I disagree with this. I really liked the first Captain America movie, but because that story of the guy who tries hard and then gets injected with serum, classic story of the guy who tries really hard and eventually gets there because of drugs.
Yeah.
But
well, no, and I agree. I will say I like that element of the story. I just think the dialogue and the pacing are terrible. I just like, it's not that I disagree with it. I just think it's a badly made story, but a good story. But I do think you're making a good point, especially because one of the things that I like about the first Cap movie is that it really highlights how much Cap is a product of the 30s and 40s. And I do think that that's an important thing to think about here with Cap and Tony. Is Cap is a product of a time when there was still a fundamental trust in institutions and in bureaucracies and in governments. And so on some level, like, when that's taken away, that's what scars him. Tony is a product of the 60s and the 70s. Tony is a product of the me generation and of individualism and of you are your own captain. And so I think it makes I never even thought of it in that perspective till you said it that way. But that really helps, I think, to better put it in.
Hold on. Continuing on that point, because there's something that while you were talking, it made me realize. So this actually points to the differences in their core characters, because when they're each presented with this problem, Captain America approaches it from the perspective of a soldier. Right? He's like, I don't want my hands tied. I don't want to be cuffed into inaction when I know what needs to be done. Right? I want to be able to do what needs to be done, and I don't want some bureaucracy, some institution tying me down or making me not able to do what I know is right. Whereas Tony Stark is approaching it from the perspective of a scientist, saying you need a system in place that is going to produce a consistent result that we all agree with. Yes, you need peer review.
Avengers.
And Captain America's like, what do you mean peer review? I have a shield. I throw it really well.
Yeah. And then also and this is actually the other part of what Andy said, is that also gets into just, we're making movies about heroes. We're not making lawsuit movies. And like the other part of what he said in that email was, or that Facebook post, to quote him again, here's what I think is a completely different take. I think Cap should have fought the Accords in federal court, blocking them in the same way Trump's travel ban was blocked. We're reading that on the day that the Supreme Court has incorrectly overturned that, but moving on with our lives. The big question about the Accords is who has justification to enforce them? Jurisdiction, thank you. In other words, Cap could have fought against the Accords without destroying an airport, although a protracted court battle would probably have broken up the Avengers anyway, and made for a very boring movie entitled Captain America Civil Suit. Now, personally, I think that Captain America, the courtroom drama, would have been fantastic, or Captain America, the bureaucratic wrangling, but I get that that's not the movie that's going to play well in the theaters that Marvel wants to play it in.
Well, I mean, yes and no. Like, do you know how well A Few Good Men did in theaters?
not Avengers good.
No, that's true. That's true.
And I think that's,
but
I agree with you. I love a good courtroom drama.
Yep.
I would have loved to see them go that way.
Or A Time to Kill, the one with Samuel Jackson and Sandra Bullock and that other guy.
A fantastic movie I fundamentally disagreed with, but a fantastic movie. So the one other comment on the Civil War thing came from Jess Plummer, who was actually our guest when we discussed Punisher, and she wrote on Twitter in terms of this idea of Team Cap or Team Tony. It's not a yes or no question, which is where actually the question was specifically about like should we be in favor of the Accords or not. It's not a yes or no question, which is where these superpowered doofs went wrong. But I'm more Team Tony than not. No, Steven, meaning Cap, Steve Rogers. No, Steven, you can't just go to foreign countries to enact whatever justice you feel like. And to me, that is such an important point that Jess is making, especially because Cap is the representation, literally, so in theory, the best parts of America. And so when Cap is presented as saying, I know what's right, I know what's good, and so I'm going to go to other parts of the country without them asking me and do what I think is needed, to me, that's actually the worst parts of America. And that's often like something that really scares me much more than I think is heroic.
Yeah, this is a great point by Jess, bringing up the imperialist angle, right? And imperialism has been a part of the American political landscape for way longer than we would like to admit, and I would argue continues to this day. But it's a case where, and again, yeah, Steve Rogers is very emblematic of that. He shows that side of like, well, no, they're doing a bad, I'm going to change the bad, right? And in the sense of how the greater world landscape works, the idea that you can just like, because you have the power, right? You have the technology in the case of some of the Avengers or actual superpowers in the case of others. You just go to another sovereign nation and do whatever you want because it's right. There's a reason why JLA is the Justice League of America. There's a huge turn in the DC comic series when the Justice League starts to actually get involved in world affairs. And it's like there are many different stories about how well they do at that. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is, so she's absolutely right. It is not a 100% Accords as written must do it this way, or like no, we no regulation, no nothing. There has to be something. There has to be some kind of sane middle ground. And the fact that neither of our heroes, the fact that Tony and Steve don't even try to approach it from the perspective of, okay, let's work on this together, is, again, that would have been a very different type of movie, wouldn't have had the physical conflict. I would have liked seeing that movie too, where they're all like, where they're struggling, and it's like 1776, where it's like pulling teeth, trying to get a little bit of momentum.
Yeah, the bureaucratic wrangling. And I will say that one, and then we really should move on. One of the things I loved about that movie, and I almost wish we'd had more of, is I think T'Challa, Black Panther, is so essential to that because he is representing quite literally the non-American superheroes, the non-first world, although Wakanda is very much a first world nation. Mm-hmm. By economic decisions, but by economic perspectives, but isn't perceived as such. Like, he represents a perspective of, wait a minute, what about the rest of the world thinks? I want to move on. So there's a couple of other episodes that we got some great commentary on. One was the Heroes on the Couch episode, which we got two great responses that I wanted to read quickly. One of our listeners, Danny B., wrote, Born Again Daredevil, which I think he's referring to, that's a specific line in the comic books, might have been the first superhero with depression. And Netflix's Jessica Jones was one of the best portrayals of PTSD that I've seen in any medium. And I think he's right. I don't know the specifics about Daredevil, and I certainly don't want to claim that it was the first with depression, but I think Daredevil, I think, is one of the first characters where we've really seen that being wrestled with. And I think that across the board, Netflix has been doing such a great job with acknowledging these issues. Mm-hmm. And the other one we got in regard to that issue was a more personal one, but I think even really important for that reason, which is the host of Stealing the Remote, another great podcast and fan of ours, and I'm a fan of theirs. He wrote, as another mostly ex-suicidal, definitely ex-teen, I really appreciate this episode. I really want to just honor that because I think it's so powerful when, as we did on that podcast, but also as others can just name like these when we're talking about mental health issues in these characters. The reason they matter is because they're issues that most of us have dealt with ourselves, or at least a lot of us have dealt with ourselves. And I know for me, and I've heard from so many others, whether it's relating to Jessica Jones's PTSD or whether it's relating to the borderline personality issues that come up in a Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, a very different show, but one I think is still super relevant, or Daredevil's depression. I think there's so much to be said for us as viewers and being able to really appreciate these stories because they represent people.
Yeah, I agree. I really appreciated these comments, and as a mostly suicidal, absolutely and thankfully ex-teen, or mostly ex-suicidal, excuse me, not mostly suicidal. I'm fine, guys. I'm doing fine. I've been fine for a long time. But yeah, like that, there was a time in my life. So that episode was, it really hit home for me as well.
Yeah. So another episode that drew a lot of attention was Ready Player One. Especially because I think a lot of people really interested in these questions, especially about the difference between the book and the movie. And I know one of the points we made in that was with this idea of that there's one sort of little throwaway comment in the movie where it seems to be making a direct commentary on Facebook and whether Facebook should be sort of taking responsibility for the role that it plays in society. And Beth Carabin, who's a friend and a listener, wrote, I was struck with the same thought with the movie, but not with the book. Perhaps it's because the Facebook privacy thing is more of a visible issue now than it was in 2014. But the scene in the movie with Morrow and Halliday talking about the consequences of their invention of the Oasis was great. I wish they developed it further. Of course, the place to develop such a thing for discussion would have been the book. Sad face, sad face, sad face, sad face, book fail.
Yeah, well, our opinions on this are well documented at this point, but there are many things the book falls on its face on. So yes, like this 100% agree. I caught the same kind of thing about the use of our data. What's funny is that even after we recorded that episode, there have been changes to Facebook. There's been a court case. There's been some scrutiny applied to how Facebook uses user data. And so like it's interesting that a movie that was like honestly not that like intellectual was really on the nose with current commentary in one way, even if it was a bit of a throwaway. So agree, Beth, agree.
Yeah, I would definitely be the same way. I think I think it's one failing of, like, I remember at one point in the book they actually mentioned that an entire presidential campaign takes place in the Oasis. But there's never a mention of that being in any way problematic, as we may have learned that even putting aside just the horrific elements of Russian interference and things like that. But even not even going that conspiracy minded, although it's certainly a conspiracy I believe in, but just the way that like how heated Facebook discussions can get, and I'm not a fan of Orson Scott Card in many, many ways. But I will say I think one thing that he got right, much more so than the author of Ready Player One did, is the degree to which online media as political debate can be manipulated. There's that major plot line in Ender's Game of Ender's two siblings basically using, I mean, to some extent, Orson Scott Card predicted the blogosphere and predicted our modern media in the way that these two can basically be trolls and can completely control discussion. And I think that's the movie gets into it, but it's one more failing of the books that it doesn't take into account, okay, if you have all of this world discourse happening online, what are the effects of that?
And on the same topic, a little bit divergent, but I've had a conversation with somebody recently who was strongly defending the book, but they were coming from a perspective of, and we've heard this before, right? Where it's a case of somebody saying, "This is intended as candy, right? It's not intended to hold up to any kind of scrutiny," and of course. My response is always like to something like well, if it doesn't hold up to scrutiny, it's probably not holding my interest very long either.
Yeah.
But like so like and I appreciate the enjoyment. We talked about the enjoyment of the thing, but I don't feel that detracts from our ability to agonize and struggle over the fact that we really wanted these topics to be more nuanced and more intellectually explored than they were in the piece of media.
Yeah, no, and I think that's true, and I think that's the idea of it doesn't have to hold up to scrutiny is one that I think has really changed, in part because I think we are now much more aware as a society that those things do matter. That Ghostbusters, which was one of my absolute favorite movies, is absolutely meant to be candy. It's not meant to be a serious movie. It's not meant to hold up to scrutiny. But I, as an 8-year-old boy, saw it, and I saw Bill Murray being a flat-out stalker, but have that be treated as a romantic thing and in the end get the girl.
Mm-hmm.
And I guarantee you that gave me some negative ideas about how romance should be. And so I think to that extent we do have to hold all these things up to scrutiny because they do have an effect, and that's the microaggression idea. In terms of our episode about devotion and the sort of who are the people who really are kind of like the devoted to a cause and to different things, Andy Peterson, who we mentioned before, he also wrote in here, quote, I think a good family example in terms of family devotion would also be Mr. Freeze. He's a good example of what you would do for those you love.
Right, Mr. Freeze being somebody who is trying to cure his wife.
Yeah.
Right, and so like he becomes a villain and does a bunch of illegal things, but his ultimate goal is to fund his research to find a cure for his wife that he's cryogenically frozen to preserve. And so there's an example of devotion to a cause driving somebody to do things that we no longer agree with.
Yeah.
And the topic, so thank you, Andy. The topic of devotion, we hadn't hit, I don't think, in that episode so much on ends means. We talked a lot about ends means, and by we I mean myself and Rob, during the Way of Kings episode, but it's a topic we're going to be circling back on in many other of these discussions because it is ultimately what we use to separate heroes from villains a lot of the time.
And I think that one of the I think what Andy's getting at is that one of the things that devotion to a cause can do is it can start blinding you to the ethical I think it is one thing to make a like in some ways I feel like Frank Castle, and maybe go back to our first question, here is a difference between the two of them. Frank Castle makes a calculated ethical decision of I am in no way ethically concerned with what is done to bad people.
Mm-hmm.
Kingpin, I feel like on some level, it's just that he is so, like Mr. Freeze, I think they're both examples of where you can be so devoted to a cause that you know in your heart is right and just and good, that anything done in service to that cause becomes right and just and good. And so you're sort of, because it has that paint over it, it's hard to actually see how morally problematic the things you're doing because that devotion can wind up blinding you in so many ways.
Right. No, exactly. So that's a topic that we talked about in that particular episode. The idea that once you get to a certain, like with Lando Malari, right? With Lando Malari, once you get to a certain,
he's from Babylon 5, one we've mentioned a couple of times.
Yes. Lando Malari from Babylon 5. He's a character who gets to a position where he wants to restore his failing government, his failing people, his failing nation. But he gets in way over his head, just completely sabotaging the thing that he wants to actually to bolster and to bring back, because he's got the blinders on. He's just like, everything that I do in service of this cause is fine, and then when he starts to get hit with consequences, he goes, oh, well, now he's in it past here.
Right.
And of course, visual gag, so nobody can actually see where my hand is. It's above my head.
Yeah. And I think that's essential, and I think that gets to a point that I hadn't really considered much before, but is that, and really I think applies to both Lando Malari and Kingpin and some of these others, which is that the other thing when you are so devoted to a cause like that is it makes you incredibly easy to manipulate. One of the plot lines that runs throughout Babylon 5 is that because Malari wants to do this so badly, anyone else can come along and say, Malari, I believe in the same cause you do, and I think we need to do this thing. Malari is going to go along with it, even though that thing is actually, often the people who are saying that don't care about the cause, they just want to benefit themselves. Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually something I don't think we've talked about before, but I think is relevant. In a lot of ways, Kingpin is a puppet. Like, he doesn't realize it, but he is absolutely being led by the nose by Madame Gao and the rest of the Hand.
He's a hand puppet.
Yes, he is
hand
absolutely
puppet.
a hand puppet. And it's sort of painful to mention that because that was so well set up, and then the payoff of what the Hand is actually doing is so poor, because Defenders and Iron Fist have problems. But even putting that aside, I think what it gets to is, and here's again going all the way back, in a way, Kingpin is where Punisher is when he's still in the military. Because Kingpin, Punisher was so devoted to his cause of believe what the colonel tells you that he winds up shooting an innocent man because they think it's true. In the same way, Fisk winds up, actively bringing about this thing that could wind up destroying all of New York City. Like, the events of Defender are direct result of the machinations that Kingpin put in play, put in motion. He has no idea about that because his devotion allows him to be manipulated so badly by Madame Gao and the rest of the Hand.
Yep, absolutely.
So, and lastly, you mentioned the Way of Kings episode, which obviously I was not able to be a part of, which I was sad about, but you and Rob McKenzie did a great job on. And there, Paul Romaine, another one of our listeners, wrote in, finally got to this episode I'd saved a while ago. I really enjoyed the discussion of the oaths and how each character's choices fit or don't fit into them. And this is just a reminder that in those books, there's the idea of these oaths that different characters take that sort of are supposed to decide how you live your life. And he continues, I had not previously appreciated how many of Kaladin's actions in particular can be viewed through that lens. I'm hopeful for a future episode on my favorite character, Seth Sun Villano. I think he provides some interesting material.
Seth Sun Villano is somebody that I will eventually talk about when we record another episode, but boy howdy, that is a giant bag of cats. That particular character is, so one of the things we talked to, so first of all, thank you, Paul. I believe his last name is pronounced Romine, but I'm not 100% on that.
Okay.
Speaking as somebody who's had his last name mispronounced basically his entire life, apologies if I got it wrong. And feel free to correct me if you see me in person, or you can give me. I speak IPA. I know the International Phonetic Alphabet. So just let me know how it's pronounced, and I'll correct it in the future. But two things I wanted to point out here. One, something that we talked about on the episode that has become more apparent as I've read more is that each of these principal characters that become these knights are fundamentally broken. Right?
Fundamentally what?
Fundamentally broken. They get mentally broken some way by some event. So Kaladin in particular is actually depressed. So getting back to that earlier topic, here's actually I feel a great example of a depressed character who is a hero in media. The more I read of Kaladin, particularly in Words of Radiance, which we haven't done an episode on that, but I plan to. The more I identified with his personal struggles in that area, it hit really close to home. But it makes that the event that we were talking about. So what Paul is referring to is one of the principal oaths of the Knights Radiant is life before death, right? And also strength before weakness, journey before destination. The journey before destination is the big one, right? It's the means before ends, right? It doesn't matter how you get there or it doesn't matter where you get to if how you get there was not well. And so
Kingpin and Punisher are not Knights Radiant.
Right, they would never be members of the Knights Radiant, not even Skybreakers. So the idea is that at some point he desecrates the corpses of his enemies to wear because they have chitinous armor skin, to wear their skin as armor because he knows that they hate it when their corpses have been desecrated, and it's going to draw all of the enemy's attention during a fight. It works fantastically, but he is basically triggering the entire army, right? He is ethically super duper problematic, right? But because again, it's a question of perspective. When we're seeing the story, we're all like, okay, he's doing this to save lives, so he's doing this in service of one oath, but he's breaking another one by doing it. So, and that particular conflict, so far in my reading has not come to a head, but it is an interesting thing about when our heroes, in service of one goal, just like with Punisher, just like with Kingpin, circling right back around to the beginning, when our heroes or our villains are doing whatever it takes to reach their particular objective, even if their particular objective is very noble, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be scrutinizing those actions and saying, well, that's not particularly heroic.
Yeah.
Right? I'm sorry, but like, you should, like, there was absolutely no need to take that guy's face and rake it across some glass.
Yeah.
Like, that's like, I get it, you're mad, but or poking the guy's eyes out like he was dead.
That's a topic I really hope I can be a part of that when we get in that podcast, because this is a whole other can of worms, or bag of cats, as you put it so well. And I admit this partially comes from the fact that I have not studied martial arts like you and like some others. But the more I have these conversations, the more I come to think that, to me, the idea of once you're fighting with violence, the idea of fighting honorably or fighting nobly is just such bullshit to me. Because on some level, I feel like what that does is perpetrate the idea that fighting can be okay. And I am, on some level, so dedicated to the idea that fighting is always, not that it should never be done, I'm not a pacifist, but that it is always going to be so bloody, so ugly, so awful, that the best way to do it is to win as fast as you fucking possibly can. And then there's still to me some lines of like not harming innocents, collateral damage, things like this. But on some level, to me, the idea of desecrating bodies in order to upset your opponent so that you can win. And that, again, not to launch that issue now, but my knee-jerk reaction is, of course you do that, or else you just keep fighting longer and more people die and the war goes on longer.
And understand, it's not so like, and one of the reasons why it's harder to put down as right or wrong, he's not doing it so that they win the battle. They're winning these battles anyway. He's doing it to protect people who are being used as cannon fodder. So there's these people who are completely unarmored, who are being rushed out in the front to draw the attention of the enemy archers. And he's all like, if all of the enemy archers are just shooting at me, and I have this magical dancing power that lets me avoid every single arrow and make sure that I don't get hurt, then I get to protect my entire team. I get to protect my people. Nobody dies.
Yeah.
Right? And so, again, very heroic end goal, but you're still doing something very, in my opinion, amoral. The thing, and we're going to have a podcast about the use of violence and violence as a means of conflict resolution.
Absolutely.
Because it is something I have very strong opinions on. But it's interesting to hear your perspective as somebody who hasn't studied martial arts. Because my perspective is when you have approached a situation where you feel violence is necessary to resolve this conflict, you do want to be efficient about, you don't want a fight to be prolonged, right? And you don't want to get yourself into a situation where your own livelihood will be compromised when you're all like, well, there's no other way, I have to do this. But there is this sense that the more control you have, so the more practiced you are, the more disciplined you are,
sure,
the less you're going to have to injure the other person in order to resolve that conflict. And that is an interesting idea.
And that I think I 100% believe in, especially because the more in control you are, the less likely you are to do collateral damage. And that's 100% something I support. For me, it's more, and this does tie into martial arts, and this is, I think, a separate conversation. To me, anything that leads you to the idea of war and fighting can be beautiful because it's noble and chivalrous and honorable. And that's the kind of stuff where I'm objecting, and it's part of why, as again I've said before, it's why I love Logan so much, because Logan is saying that fighting the good fight is still brutal and awful and terrible. I want to read we're way over time now, and so I want to read the last quote and it kind of goes some final comments. And that was in regard to the Be Super episode, which I know you were not part of, but where we had a great discussion with the founder of the Be Super project, which I'm going to include a link to. It's a fantastic project that is really all about taking the ideas of the superhero world, these ideas that we're talking about, and applying them to real life. Like really asking people, like, okay, you've seen Black Panther. What questions does it raise to you about racism? How can you live that out? And I think it's just such an amazing thing. And so I just want to honor someone else who really noticed that, Megan Dumas, who wrote in, as someone who has but isn't using an education degree, this episode, especially the first half, really got my senses tingling. Picturing how to incorporate this into a high school history and English setting, and the idea of using this media and jittering discussion makes me happy. And Megan, I want to thank you so much, and I want to say that if that happened, the credit goes much more to the Be Super project and to us, and I feel like we're just here the megaphone for Be Super, which I'm really glad we can do. But to me, I kind of wanted to close with that because more than anything, that's what I kind of want out of this podcast, is that I hope that for all of our listeners, I hope this is a really enjoyable thing to listen to. I hope that you get to have some discussion stimulated, and I hope that you get to sit in your car and yell at the radio and tell me or Jacob or Paul how we're wrong. But I also hope that as I am, and that I think all of us are, that as we're raising these ethical questions, you're not just thinking about them as abstract literary questions. You are thinking about how do they apply to your own life. How do these questions of, what does it mean to be a hero or villain? Think about how do you deal with it when you think someone at work or in a relationship has wronged you, and questions about violence come up and things like that. So I just wanted to close with that. That to me, I think definitely check out the Be Super project. And I hope that as you're listening to this podcast, one of the things you're thinking about is how are these questions that people with superpowers are dealing with similar to the questions that we're dealing with in our own life? And how do we use this? How do we use this to not only affect change in our own lives, but to go out and talk to others?
Yeah, I don't actually really have much to add to that. Thank you, Megan. I really enjoyed listening to that episode, and I think the Be Super project is a fascinating idea. It's something that it contains ideas that we all could stand to apply to our lives, because we, in many ways, can be the heroes that we are idolizing, much more than they are, because those are stories, and we do live in the real world, and we can make a difference.
Yep, absolutely. So, how are you guys making a difference? That's actually a great question to think about. How are you? How I would love to hear from anyone if there's a way that something you've seen in a superhero or a comic book or sci-fi or fantasy in any of these genres. What's a way that you've seen that, or and it's given you something to think about, or it's given you something that changes the way you view the world, or something like that? Let us know. You can find us on Facebook or on Twitter at Superhero Ethics. You can email us at superheroethics@gmail.com. And any of those ways, obviously, we love to get feedback, and we would love to take your feedback and read it on the air. So on behalf of myself, on behalf of Jacob, on behalf of Paul, on behalf of all of you guys, all of our great listeners who have sent in so many great comments, thank you so much, and have a good day.
So you said we're more the megaphone, but we're actually a little bit under 1 billion microphones.
Yeah.
From a megaphone.
Yeah.
Given that a microphone is 1,000th of a phone, and a megaphone would be 1,000,000 phones.
Yeah, that's probably true. Well played.